Every great story is an iron odyssey, a long and difficult journey that tests the very limits of human endurance and will. Follow our characters as they navigate the rocky paths of fate to find their ultimate home. Subscribe today and join the most epic journey of the digital age.
My sister announced my divorce before I could at her graduation party, in front of her entire department, her advisor, and the man who would later offer me the job that changed everything. She didn't whisper it. She said it the way people say things they've been waiting to say for a long time, with a kind of relief in her voice, like she was finally setting down something heavy. That's my older sister over there, the one who couldn't keep a husband or a career. We keep inviting her to things out of obligation, but honestly, she's more comfortable around mops than people. A few people laughed. The polite kind. The kind that says, I don't want to be rude by not reacting. I was standing near the back of the tent holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, wearing the only nice dress I still owned after splitting our apartment, and I felt the ground go quiet under my feet. Not the noise kept going. The jazz quartet my parents had hired continued playing something upbeat and irrelevant, but the ground under me went quiet the way it does when something breaks in a place you can't see. My sister's name is Bethany. She had just finished her PhD in computational linguistics at Northwestern, and our parents had rented out a private pavilion at a botanical garden outside Chicago to celebrate. It was June. The flowers were loud and beautiful and absolutely indifferent to what was happening to me. I want to explain something before I go further, because if I don't, you'll ask the same question people always ask. Why did you even go? I went because my mother called me 3 weeks before the party and said in her most carefully controlled voice that it would look strange if I didn't come. She said Bethany had worked very hard. She said this was an important milestone. She said the whole family would be there and it would be noticed if I wasn't. She didn't say please. She never did. My father called 2 days later. He said Bethany had mentioned that some of her colleagues would be attending, along with her dissertation advisor and a few people from a research institute she was hoping to collaborate with. He said these were important connections for her. He said I should come but keep a low profile. He said, and I remember the exact words because I wrote them down afterward in the Notes app on my phone, "Don't give anyone a reason to ask about your situation. This day is about Bethany." My situation, as he called it, was that I had separated from my husband 8 months earlier, after 6 years of a marriage that had slowly calcified into two people being professionally courteous to each other in a shared apartment. We had no children. We had a cat that he kept. The divorce wasn't final yet, but it was inevitable, and my family treated it the way they treated most of my choices, as evidence of a fundamental flaw in my character that they had always suspected and were now grieved to have confirmed. I had also, in the past year, left my job as a corporate paralegal at a firm downtown. It wasn't dramatic. The firm had restructured, my position was eliminated, and I had spent the following months doing freelance legal document translation, which paid the bills but which my family treated as equivalent to unemployment. What they chose not to retain was that I had spent 4 years before the paralegal job working as a court-certified interpreter, fluent in Mandarin and conversational in Cantonese, serving as a bridge between defendants, attorneys, and a legal system that moved too fast for people who were already afraid. They knew. I had told them. But knowing a fact and allowing it to take up space in your understanding of a person are two different things. And my family had decided who I was long before I had done anything worth deciding about. So I went to the party. I wore the dress. I stood in the back of the tent and I watched Bethany accept congratulations from people who leaned in close when she talked, who asked follow-up questions, who laughed at the right moments. She had always known how to hold a room. I had always known how to stand at the edge of one. The tent was set up along a gravel path between 2 hedgerows, round tables with white linens, centerpieces of pale flowers I couldn't name, a long table along one side with catered food from a restaurant I recognized from the neighborhood where my ex-husband and I used to live. My place card was at a table near the service entrance, tucked between an elderly cousin no one talked to and 2 empty chairs. I understood the assignment. My parents were at the center table with Bethany and her boyfriend and her advisor, a woman named Dr. Feiner, Ellison, who was apparently something of a figure in natural language processing research. I had looked her up the week before the party. The way I sometimes research things I wasn't sure why I was researching. Dr. Huzdilan, Ellison had published extensively, consulted for several technology firms, and most recently had joined the advisory board of a company called Lantern Analytics, which built AI-assisted language tools for legal and medical contexts. I noticed her because she was the only person at the party who wasn't performing. Everyone else was wearing their best version of themselves, laughing a little louder than necessary, mentioning things casually that weren't casual at all. Dr. Ellison was just watching. She had the kind of stillness that comes from having spent a long time thinking carefully about things, and she was applying it to the room with the same focus I imagined she applied to her work. She noticed me before Bethany mentioned me. I saw it happen. A brief look across the tent, the way you look at something that doesn't fit the pattern you're expecting, a slight pause in her attention. Then Bethany made her announcement and Dr. Ellison's gaze sharpened. I want to be clear about something. I didn't fall apart. I had been practicing not falling apart for the better part of a year, and I had gotten reasonably good at it. I stood there with my glass of sparkling water and I breathed evenly, and I thought about the fact that the hydrangeas along the far hedge were a particularly good shade of blue, and I waited for the moment to pass. My mother turned to look at me from her table with an expression that was apologetic in the way that contains no actual apology, the face of someone who regrets the inconvenience of a scene but not the conditions that created it. My father did not turn around at all. Bethany moved on. She always moved on quickly. She had a gift for saying something that landed and then stepping cleanly away from it before the debris settled. She was already laughing at something her boyfriend said, her hand on his arm, her attention somewhere bright and forward-facing. The jazz quartet started a new song. People went back to their conversations. I set my glass down on an empty tray and thought about leaving. And then I heard it, 2 tables away. Near the edge of the tent, where the hedge created a natural corner, Dr. Tizzle. Ellison was speaking quietly with a younger man I hadn't noticed before, tall, early 40s, with the slightly distracted look of someone who spends most of their time thinking about something you can't see. They were speaking in Mandarin, not the careful, slowed-down Mandarin of language learners or people making a point of being impressive, the real kind. The kind with the rhythm of a first language, with shortcuts and dropped words, and the particular cadence that sounds different in a room than it does in a classroom. I understood every word. They were discussing a contract, something about a pilot program, legal documentation for a county court system somewhere in the Midwest, the challenge of finding qualified interpreters who could also handle technical terminology. The younger man, I would learn his name was Edward, that he was the CEO of Lantern Analytics, was saying they had interviewed 8 candidates and none of them had been right. He said the legal vocabulary was the problem. Most interpreters could handle conversation, but not the specific register of courtroom procedure, motions, objections, the language that had to be exact, because a single wrong word could mean the difference between something being admissible and something being thrown out. Dr. Time. Ellison said she understood the problem. She said she had been thinking about it. Then she looked across the tent at me, not casually, directly. I looked back at her because I didn't know what else to do. She said something to Edward in Mandarin. I caught it clearly. She's been standing there listening. Her posture changed when we switched languages. He turned to look at me too. His expression was the expression of someone doing a rapid recalibration, sorting through assumptions, finding them insufficient. I had 2 options. I could look away. I had spent a lot of years looking away. Or I could stop. I walked over to their table. I don't know exactly what I intended when I started moving. I think I had been standing at the edge of that tent for so long that forward felt like the only direction left. I stopped a few feet from them and said in Mandarin that I hoped I wasn't interrupting something private. The silence that followed was very short, maybe 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds had a texture to them. They felt like the moment before something tips. Dr. Ellison said in English, "Please sit down." I sat. Edward leaned forward slightly. He asked how long I had been listening. I told him I had heard them switch languages and caught most of the conversation about the contract. He asked if I had understood the legal terminology specifically. I said yes, and I used 2 of the terms they had mentioned. One related to chain of custody documentation, one related to the standard for interpreter certification under federal court guidelines. To show him I wasn't being approximate, he was quiet for a moment. Dr. Term. Ellison said, also in Mandarin, ask her about the procedural difference between state and federal interpretation standards. He asked. I answered. In Mandarin, with the specific vocabulary, without pausing to search for words. The silence afterward was the kind I hadn't heard in a long time. Not the silence of a room ignoring you. The silence of a room reconsidering. I became aware, gradually, that the conversation near us had quieted. Not because people had stopped talking. They hadn't. But because something had shifted in the acoustic texture of the tent. A few people at nearby tables had turned slightly without quite looking, the way you adjust when something changes in your peripheral vision. Bethany noticed. I saw her face from across the tent, the moment she recognized that something was happening at a table she hadn't planned for. She excused herself from her boyfriend and started moving toward us with the smooth efficiency of someone who has spent a lifetime managing situations. My parents followed her with their eyes and then, a beat later, with their bodies. Bethany reached our table first. She put her hand lightly on the back of an empty chair, claiming the space without quite sitting down, and smiled at Dr. Ellison with the full warmth of someone who has something to protect. "I'm so glad you two are talking," she said. "My sister has a lot of thoughts." "She means well." Dr. Herr. Ellison looked at Bethany for a moment. Then she looked back at me. "Your sister," she said, "has just given me a more precise account of federal interpretation standards than most of the candidates we formally interviewed." Bethany's smile stayed in place, but it reorganized itself. The warmth relocated. What was left was something more careful. My father arrived at the edge of our table. He had the expression he always had when he was trying to assess a situation quickly. Chin slightly elevated, eyes moving. My mother stood just behind him. "I hope she hasn't been bothering you," my father said. He directed this at Dr. Ellison in the way that manages to apologize for a person without speaking to them. "She's going through a difficult period." Dr. Ellison set down her glass. "I'm not bothered," she said. "I'm interested." She turned to Edward and said something brief in Mandarin. He nodded and opened a leather notebook that had been sitting closed on the table. Then she turned to me and asked, in Mandarin, a question about the specific legal framework governing court interpretation in Illinois, a question that required knowing not just the language but the statute, the certification requirements, the procedural distinctions between criminal and civil proceedings. It was the kind of question designed to find the outer boundary of what someone actually knows, as opposed to what they claim to know. I answered it completely. I cited the relevant Illinois statute number from memory because I had spent 3 years working under it daily, and it was the kind of thing that doesn't leave you. My father was standing close enough to hear everything and understand none of it. I watched the realization move across his face, not the understanding of what I was saying, because he had no Mandarin, but the understanding that something was happening that he had not prepared for and could not redirect. Bethany took a step back. Not a large step. Just enough. Edward closed his notebook and looked at me. He said, in English, "Can I ask what you're doing currently?" I told him. "Freelance legal document translation, some contract work, looking for the right fit." I didn't apologize for it. I had been apologizing for things for a long time, and I had recently decided to stop. He nodded slowly. He said they had been struggling to find someone who could operate at the intersection of legal procedure and language interpretation, someone who understood both the technical vocabulary and the cultural register, someone who could work directly with clients as well as documentation. Dr. Taver. Ellison said, "We've been looking for 3 months." She slid a business card across the table. The card had the Lantern Analytics name on it in simple type, her name below it, a phone number, and an email. "Call me Monday," she said. "We have a project that I think you're exactly right for. If you're interested." I picked up the card. I looked at it for a moment. "I'm interested," I said. My mother made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. My father said, "There may be some misunderstanding about her qualifications." Dr. Ellison looked at him. Just looked. She didn't say anything for a moment, and the moment lasted long enough that my father heard himself. "I don't think there's a misunderstanding," she said. "I think I have a fairly clear picture." She stood, which was clearly a signal, because Edward stood too, and they both turned back toward me with the focused attention of people who have something they want to accomplish and have just found a piece they were missing. "Monday," Dr. Ellison said again. And then she and Edward excused themselves and moved toward another part of the tent, and I was left sitting at the table with my parents and Bethany standing around me in a loose formation that no longer meant what it had meant an hour ago. Bethany said my name. Her voice was different than it had been during her announcement. Flatter, the performance turned down. I said nothing. My father started to say something about misrepresentation. About how I should have been upfront about my background from the beginning. About how this was not the time or place. I noticed that his complaint had quietly shifted from, "You embarrassed us," to "You weren't transparent," and I found that interesting. I stood up. I picked up the business card and put it in the small pocket of my dress that I had specifically chosen the dress for, because it had a pocket. "I told you," I said. "For years I told you about the interpreter work, about the certification, about the cases I handled. You didn't retain it because it didn't fit what you'd already decided about me." "That's not a misrepresentation. That's just you not listening." I walked away from the table. Behind me, I heard Bethany say my name again, and my mother say something about how this was not the time, and my father say something about a conversation later, and the jazz quartet begin a slow, irrelevant ballad about something I couldn't make out from where I was standing. I walked through the tent, past the centerpieces, past the long table of catered food, past the elderly cousin at my assigned table who was eating a small plate of things and paying no attention to any of us. And I walked out through the opening in the hedge and into the parking lot, and I stood next to my car in the June heat and breathed. I called Dr. Ellison on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Her assistant answered, said my name before I finished giving it, and scheduled a meeting for that Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon at Lantern Analytics' office in the West Loop. I spent the weekend reading everything I could find about the company, about their projects, about the specific challenge of legal language technology in multilingual court systems. I had not thought about this material in a focused way for almost 2 years, and sitting with it again felt like putting weight on a foot you thought was broken and finding out it had healed without your noticing. The office was in a converted industrial building, exposed brick and high ceilings, the kind of space that signals a particular kind of company, serious but not corporate, efficient but not cold. Dr. Ellison met me in a conference room with glass walls that looked out over the open floor plan. Edward was there, 2 other people whose names I wrote down and still have. Dr. Ellison explained the project in specific terms. Lantern Analytics was piloting an AI-assisted platform for court interpretation in 3 counties in the Midwest. The platform could handle routine translation tasks but flagged anything requiring human review, and the human review required someone who understood both the language and the legal context well enough to catch errors that a non-expert might not recognize as errors. They needed someone who could serve as a senior interpreter reviewer, work directly with the county court systems to establish protocols, and help train the next phase of the platform on edge cases. The position came with a salary I had not earned in 5 years. It came with benefits and a title and, for the first time in a long time, a clear sense of what I was for. "Why didn't you mention any of this at the party?" Edward asked at one point, not unkindly. "Just curious. I thought about it." "Because no one asked," I said. "And I've learned that offering unsolicited evidence of your own competence to people who've already decided you don't have any is mostly just tiring." He nodded. He seemed to understand that from a different angle than I meant it. But the understanding landed somewhere true. I accepted the offer before I left the building. I shook hands with Dr. Ellison at the elevator, and she looked at me with the same steady attention she had used at the party, the look of someone checking that the thing she thought she found is actually there. "The party," she said. "Your sister's announcement. Were you expecting that?" "I was expecting something," I said, "just not the exact shape of it." She nodded. "For what it's worth," she said, "what you demonstrated at that table was not something people can perform. You either have it or you don't." I thanked her. The elevator came. I rode down alone. The news moved through the channels it moves through. Former colleagues reached out. People I hadn't heard from in 2 years sent LinkedIn messages. My phone did things I had forgotten phones could do. My family was slower. My father called 4 days after I started the new position. His voice was calibrated, not quite apologetic, not quite defensive, somewhere in the careful middle ground where a person can retreat without technically having admitted anything. He said he had heard from my mother that things had worked out. He said he was glad. He said he had always known I had abilities, that the concern had never been about ability, it had been about choices and stability and whether I was making the most of what I had. I listened to the whole thing. I had learned over the years that interrupting these speeches was less satisfying than letting them finish, because at the end of them you could see clearly the shape of what they actually were. When he was done, I said, "I know you believe that, Dad." There was a pause. "I hope we can have dinner soon," he said. "Maybe," I said, and I meant it as maybe, not as yes disguised as uncertainty, which was how I used to mean it. Bethany waited longer, 6 weeks. She texted rather than called, which I understood. A text allows you to draft, to revise, to send a version of yourself that has been corrected for errors. The text said she wanted to talk, that she had been thinking about what happened, that she wasn't sure she had handled things well. I read it 3 times. I thought about what I wanted from her, not what I was supposed to want, not the reconciliation narrative that would make a cleaner story, but what I actually wanted from the specific person who was my sister and who had stood in a garden tent in June and made me the punchline of her celebration. What I wanted, I realized, was not an apology delivered in a format that allowed her to revise it before sending. What I wanted was for her to understand that the thing she had done was not a slip, not a momentary bad judgment, but the result of a very long habit of seeing me as something that existed in contrast to her rather than on its own terms. I didn't think a text conversation was going to get us there. I texted back, "I'm not ready yet. I'll reach out when I am." She didn't respond immediately. When she did, she said, "Okay, I'll wait." That was something. Not everything, but something. Not everything, but something. The project took me to 3 counties over 4 months. I sat in courtrooms and conference rooms and once a converted library basement where the county had set up a temporary hearing space. I reviewed hundreds of flagged interpretations, caught errors that ranged from minor inaccuracies to the kind of mistranslation that could substantively affect a proceeding, and built protocols that the platform's next training cycle would incorporate. I met defendants who looked at me with the specific relief of someone hearing their own language in a room that had been moving too fast and too foreign. I met attorneys who initially treated me as a piece of equipment and then, gradually, as a colleague. I met judges who asked careful questions and listened to the answers. The work was not glamorous, some of it was tedious. Some of it was heartbreaking in the particular way that work at the intersection of language and justice can be heartbreaking. When you are the person holding the gap between what someone said and what someone heard and understanding exactly how wide that gap is. I was, finally, in a room that fit me. On a Thursday in October, I was eating lunch at a sandwich place near one of the courthouses when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't have saved. The message said, "This is Bethany's advisor, Dr. Ellison. I wanted to let you know we've submitted the pilot results to the grant committee. Your work was cited specifically. I thought you should hear it from me." I sat with that for a while. Then I texted back, "Thank you for finding me at that party." She replied, "I didn't find you. I watched you hold still while everyone around you looked away. That's a different thing." I thought about my sister making her announcement to a tent full of people who laughed the polite laugh and moved on. I thought about my father's phone call and his careful grammar of non-apology. I thought about the years I had spent trying to fit my history into the version of me they had decided on, and the quiet, specific exhaustion of that, and the way it had finally lifted. I thought about the woman I had been at the edge of that tent, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, and I felt something for her that wasn't quite pity, and wasn't quite pride, something closer to recognition. The way you feel when you see a photograph of yourself from a hard year and realize the person in it was doing better than they knew. A few months later, I called Bethany. We met at a coffee shop equidistant between both of our apartments, a neutral place the way neutral places are always slightly too aggressively neutral, a little too many plants, music slightly too quiet. We sat across from each other with drinks. We both wrapped our hands around and for a while we just existed in the same space without trying to solve it. She said she had been wrong. She said it plainly, without the revision, the way I had needed her to say it. She said she had used me as a contrast for so long that she had stopped seeing me as a separate person. And she said she understood now how that had calcified into something she didn't fully recognize as cruelty until she saw someone else look at me the way Dr. Ellison had. "What did she see?" Bethany asked. I thought about it. "I think she just looked," I said, without already knowing what she was going to find. My sister was quiet. Outside the window, someone walked past with a very small dog wearing a sweater printed with pumpkins, because it was November and Chicago in November has a particular insistence on seasonal accessories. "I'm gonna try to do that," Bethany said. "It might take me a while, but I want to try." I told her I wasn't going to pretend the party hadn't happened or that the years before it hadn't happened. I told her I wasn't interested in performing a forgiveness I hadn't arrived at yet, just because it would make things neater. But I told her I was willing to find out who we could be to each other if we started from an honest place. She said that was fair. It was. I have found, in the time since, that fair is usually enough to start with. The rest comes later, or it doesn't, and you learn which one over time. What I know now, what I am still learning in the way that things worth knowing have to be learned over and over, is that the story other people tell about you is not a fact about you. It is a fact about them. About what they needed to believe, what they could not afford to see, what they had already decided before the evidence was in. My family needed me to be smaller than I was. It made their own choices feel more deliberate. It made their own successes feel more earned. I was never smaller than I was. I was just standing in a part of the room where no one was looking. The work is finding the part of the room where the light is. And when someone turns towards you in that light and actually sees you, you don't have to say a word. You just have to have been there all along. Which I was. The whole time, I just didn't know anyone was finally looking. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that June afternoon in the garden tent. Not the dramatic version, not the moment Dr. Ellison slid her card across the table, or the look on my father's face when he realized he couldn't follow a word of the conversation. I've thought about the quieter thing underneath all of it. The thing that was true before any of it happened and would have stayed true even if Dr. Ellison had never turned her head. I had the skills the whole time. I had the certifications, the experience, the 3 years of courtroom work, the specific legal vocabulary that took me years to build in 2 languages. None of that appeared at the party. None of that was created by Edward's notebook or my sister's stunned silence. It existed in me in the particular way that things you have genuinely worked for exist. Not as a credential you can lose, but as a way of understanding the world that becomes part of how you think. What I didn't have for a long time was anyone willing to look at me without the story my family had already written. And here's what I've come to believe about that. Not as a comfortable idea, but as something I've watched play out in real time, in my own life and in the lives of people I've worked alongside since. The story other people tell about you eventually runs out of room. It can only survive as long as the people around you are willing to accept it without checking. The moment someone with fresh eyes looks directly at you, the moment they ask a real question and wait for a real answer, the story either proves itself or it collapses. My family's version of me collapsed the second Dr. Ellison asked about Illinois interpretation statutes, and I answered without pausing. That's not luck. That's the long, slow consequence of having actually done the work. Bethany's cruelty at her party was real. My father's practiced indifference was real. The years of being managed and minimized and seated near the service entrance, all of it was real, and I'm not going to tidy it up by pretending it didn't cost me anything. It cost me time. It cost me the particular exhaustion of having to carry your own worth without anyone helping you hold it. But I kept doing the work anyway. I kept the certifications current. I kept the Mandarin sharp enough that when 2 professionals switched languages in a tent in Chicago, I followed every word. I didn't do that because I was waiting for a reward. I did it because I am someone who does the work, and that turned out to be the most important thing about me. More important than my marriage, more important than my job title, more important than whether my family understood me on any given Sunday. Integrity is not what you perform when people are watching, it's what remains when the performance is over and you're still the same person you were before anyone looked. I was that person in the tent before Dr. Ellison turned her head. I would have been that person if she hadn't. The fact that she did, the fact that someone finally looked, was not justice delivered from the outside. It was just the natural result of being real in a room full of people pretending. Eventually, Reality has a way of becoming visible. Not always, not on any schedule you can count on. But often enough that the only rational response is to keep being real anyway, to keep building the thing that is genuinely yours, and to trust that the gap between who you are and what people have decided about you is their problem to eventually reconcile, not yours to endlessly explain. I'm still learning that. Some days I feel it clearly. Some days Bethany texts me something careful, and I feel the old weight come back for a moment before it lists again. But I know what I know, and I know it in two languages.